Hello, my name is Brittany Slayback, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky Department of Biology. And today I'm going to talk to you about the discipline of ethology, or the study of behavior. It's one of the oldest scientific disciplines, being founded around 1905-ish, the early 1900s at least, by three gentlemen, Carl von Frisch, Nico Tinbergen, and Konrad Lorenz. And these three gentlemen all arrived at the similar or same ideas of the importance of understanding how an organism interacts with its environment. They arrived at these ideas by just taking a walk in the woods. So they were all natural historians and enjoyed walking their personal farm grounds and observing birds and other wildlife that might be around. Over time, they took a lot of notes. They would come back after their walk and write down everything that they saw and what the animals were doing. And they eventually saw patterns in behavior. So as the seasons changed, they saw different types of bird species more often than not. Or they saw how chipmunks were caching different types of nuts, maybe at a quicker rate because it was getting a little bit colder. It's a good indication to start the wood fire. Through these notes and these patterns, they realized that they needed some sort of systematic way to investigate these behaviors. So they were curious why. Okay, winter's coming, you need more food. That makes sense for a chipmunk, right? If you don't want to go out in a cold winter, you want to make sure that you've already gone to the grocery store and the freezer's stocked. Chipmunk does the same thing. But in order to test these hypotheses, they needed a way to quantify this, which is how the ethogram came about. An ethogram is simply a catalog of behaviors. So these three scientists had a catalog of behaviors that they had observed for chipmunks or the bird species, and each species had its own catalog. So any behavior that they had ever observed. And through an ethogram, what they could then do with these, with an ethogram, is test the assumptions that they had made. So they could then go out and see the frequency of each individual behavior on the catalog. And this gave them some sort of foundation to actually test these initial theories and assumptions of why an organism might be interacting with its environment the way that it is. For today's purposes and for our modern day purposes, we still use ethograms on a daily basis. I myself am an animal behaviorist and use them to study large ungulates. I've also used them to study seabirds and primates. It's a way that we can actually systematically quantify these behaviors and compare between species. It also gives us an indication of how these species interact with their environments and what physiological mechanisms might be underlying these behaviors. So if we change a physiological mechanism, for instance in a lab setting, an ethogram approach or supplement this change with an ethogram of behaviors, we can then see how that physiological mechanism influences the organismal behavior and vice versa. So general background on how the ethogram came about, what it is, catalog of behaviors, and so now, how do we make one? Is that good?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so now we know what an ethogram is, catalog of behavior. So how do we make one? Well, first, you just need to write down what you see. So we can have species name. We'll use my current species, which is an elk. Behavior. And then you just list all observed behaviors. This is the basis of an ethogram. This isn't what I would take out in the field to quantify my behavior, but this gives us an indication of where to start and what behaviors to look at. In order to start developing these, we do just what von Frisch, Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen did, and we sit down and we watch an organism. We want to take this and actually use this in a field or a lab setting. We need some way to quantify this. So we think about our question. Are we interested in how often organisms interact with each other? If so, we might want to look at the frequency, so how many times two organisms, or two, in this instance, elk, might actually come into interaction with each other over sunset time period. Because we can't watch elk all day long, as much as I would love to, have other things to do. So we take a sample of their day in terms of time, and we can extrapolate that out to understand what their overall behavioral profile might be. So in that case, my behavior would be some sort of interaction. There's a couple different types of interaction. So, maybe they're fighting over food, so it's an aggressive interaction. In this fight, there's going to be a winner and a loser. The loser might end up doing some sort of submissive interaction to let the winner know, okay, you can have my food plot. The alternative to that, so there might be some sort of dominance interaction where that winner is letting them know, I just won this fight, you need to back away from my refrigerator. So we'll go out with a piece of paper and a pencil is all you need. You have your catalog of behaviors that you're interested in, and at certain time points, whatever you decide, for me, I use every 5 minutes, I will mark down if an aggressive, submissive, or dominance interaction happens. So in this instance, if these separate columns all represented a 5-minute time point, I could then look and see the frequency of different types of behaviors within a 15-minute span. There's a variety of different ways we can do this, and one example that I'm going to give you today from a laboratory perspective is working with Drosophila melanogaster, the classic fruit fly. To give another example, one great way that we can actually use an ethogram is, again, to look at how physiological mechanisms might correlate with behavior and vice versa. So, sticking with the elk example, there's certain parasites that if an elk is infected with, they'll just demonstrate different behaviors than compared to a fully healthy elk. Here I've changed the ethogram. Each column represents 5 minutes. So we're going to be doing observations at 5-minute time intervals for a total of 20 minutes. 3 behaviors that we actually look for in elk that are potentially infected with this parasite is if they're panting. So if they're standing out in the middle of nowhere with their mouth open, panting, it's a pretty good indication that something else physiologically is going on besides them just being heat stressed. Ataxic behavior, which is a fancy way to say they're wobbling around, they might be walking in circles, they're not balanced. And also decreased flight distance. Let's stick with this one for just a second though, because decreased flight distance, it's a pretty subjective term. What do we mean by decreased? Decreased by how much? How are we originally measuring it? We'll start with, what in the world is flight distance? Flight distance simply means if I was to walk up to an elk, how long does it take them to run away from me? Are they scared of novel creatures, humans being one of them, in the environment, or are they just not fazed by it? Do they just kind of hang out? With a behavior like decreased flight distance, we need to decide well in advance what we mean by decreased. Because again, by how much? So we have to have some sort of a baseline. And that's where we'll go back to our original ethogram in that catalog. So we can go back and actually look and say, okay, the typical flight distance for elk, if I approach them, I can only get 150 feet to them before they run away. We can then look and do different trials with different individuals who we think might be sick. Walk up to them, get 150 feet, how often do they walk away? And that's actually what we'll quantify, if they walked away or not. So even within the ethogram itself, you really have to think about each individual behavior because in many ways they're subjective. It's something that we're observing of the animal. We have to make sure that we're observing it in a quantifiable manner. As in, I was to write decreased flight distance on this ethogram, and then I also asked you to calculate decreased flight distance. making sure that we're calculating the same things. But this is one perfect example of how, when I'm out in the field, if there's an increase in any of these behaviors that I might see, it's a pretty good indication that that organism is infected with some sort of parasite which is influencing their physiological mechanisms, and we're seeing it at a behavioral level.